This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. From the classroom to the workplace, emotional intelligence has become a buzzword. But what does it really mean to understand and regulate our emotions? And why does it matter? Joining me now is Marc Brackett. He's the founding director of the Yale Center for Emotional Intelligence. He's developed a framework called RULER, which stands for Recognize, Understand, Label, Express, and Regulate. It's a method being used in over 5,000 schools nationwide, including right here in Connecticut. Brackett is also the author of a new book, Dealing with Feeling. Use your emotions to create the life you want. Marc, it's so good to have you on the show today.
Great to be here. Thank you for having me.
So many of us have heard the phrase, feel your feelings. It sounds so simple, but in your experience, is this something that most adults know how to do and how to do it effectively?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's a kind of a buzzword, right? Feel your feelings.
Sure.
I think for us, it means self-awareness. It means knowing the emotions that you're specifically feeling, like the words. And knowing what to do with those feelings is a big piece of this. And that's oftentimes the piece that's not talked about enough, which is obviously why I wrote this new book called Dealing with Feeling, because experiencing emotions is one thing, using your emotions wisely is another thing.
And of course, that's something that we're going to dig into today. And with your most recent book that's available now called Dealing with Feeling, Harness Your Emotions to Create the Life You Want. So in it, you break down some important language and definitions, like the phrase emotional regulation, which listeners today, you're going to hear a lot of it. The word regulation is very intentional, but I think it's also tripped up some people, right? So what do you mean by regulation and how is it different from controlling?
It's a great question. A lot of people think of regulation as control, like don't show how you're feeling or hold it inside, or some people even think of it as suppressing or denying or even ignoring emotion. And it couldn't be anything further from that. Emotion regulation is about using our emotions wisely to achieve our goals in life. That's the simple definition. I can give you a more elaborate one, which is emotion regulation is the thoughts and the actions. So how we shift our thinking and what we do to prevent unwanted emotions, reduce the difficult ones, initiate the ones we want to have, maintain the ones that we want to keep, or even enhance emotions. And importantly, it's all in the service of having good decisions or making good decisions, having good relationships, having good mental and physical health, and achieving our goals.
So it sounds like, I mean, the nature of language, I think, often happens where we start conflating certain phrases because at the same time, you also point out that regulation is not the same thing as resignation. So that's a distinction you made when talking about activism specifically. So can you expand on that? Why is it important that we don't mistake the two?
Because I think oftentimes people think of regulation as like holding back or not speaking your truth. And it's not that. We all need to speak our truth. We just need to do it in a way that helps us achieve our goals. And if we do it in a very dysregulated way, what happens is that people don't want to listen to us. I mean, how many of us like to be around the emotionally dysregulated colleague or partner or kid? You know, it puts us on, makes us walk on eggshells. It makes us want to retaliate oftentimes.
Well, and then so talking about the flip side too, because you've also said that we're living through an overreaction epidemic, and you've also received some mixed responses to that warning. So can you talk about what you meant by that and respond to the people who disagree?
Yes, I actually wrote a second piece about that because it was one of those things that was shocked by the response to that. I just want to put it out there that when you write op-eds, you don't always title them yourself. So anyhow, but I do believe that we are in this kind of epidemic of, yelling and screaming. It's not only overreaction from an external perspective, but it's an overreaction from an internal perspective of people drinking way too much alcohol, people engaging in a lot of avoidance. And that's a different kind of overreaction, but it kind of impacts your health and internally. And the problem with that is that it doesn't lead to good outcomes for our mental well-being or our relationships, or in many ways, helping us achieve our goals.
And you've also argued that emotional regulation is the biggest predictor of success in life. How did you get there? Why do you think it's so important?
Well, what I'm trying to actually make the case for is that emotion regulation should be the new definition of success, which is even a bigger or more audacious goal. And when you think about the world we're living in today, I mean, there is a lot of dysregulation. If you watch any television show, right, you see it, or news station. If you think about our high school kids today, they have not been alive when there has not been a war, climate crises, political polarization. I mean, it's endless what they're witnessing that's impacting their nervous system. It's impacting my nervous system, to be frank. Um, you have social media, which is pulling people away from connecting in healthy ways to other real people. The average teenager spending 6 to 7 hours a day scrolling, on their phones or on social media, and it's causing a crisis of anxiety. It's causing depression. It's causing disconnection. And so I put all that there because I like to imagine a world where people make better choices about how they spend their time. I like to imagine a world where government leaders are role models for healthy emotion regulation, where CEOs of companies, where parents and teachers are. And that world looks very different to me. It looks like a world that's filled with empathy, compassion, sound decision making, etc.
So I do want to get into more of how the digital space has changed and transformed the way we deal with our emotions or not deal with our emotions. And so I want to get into that in a little bit, but because you mentioned sort of our nervous systems constantly in a state of fight or flight, how does that hold us back in life, you think?
It holds us back a number of ways because when we are in that fight, flight, or freeze state, we're not in present mode state. And so it's hard to be your full self when your brain is constantly activated to protect itself. And that's just basic biology in terms of how our nervous system connects to our brains, which are, all connected anyhow. And so when you think about it, if you are feeling extreme stress, your brain is saying, attend to that, get that need met. As a kid, for example, I was terribly bullied in school. I hated school. I was not concerned about algebra, trigonometry, World War, One history. I was worrying about survival because if you're in a classroom where kids are making fun of you, if you are being bullied on the bus, you're just thinking about surviving. Now, that's my story, but there are many stories of people from different racial, ethnic backgrounds today in our country. There are stories of people who have learning differences or are struggling. Um, and the point of it all is that when we are in fight, flight, freeze mode, we're not in learning mode, we're not in cultivating relationship mode, we're not in good decision making mode.
I think I want to come back to that because I do want to ask if you have any tips on how to break out of the cycle. But I think before we get there, is it safe to say that conversations about emotions and emotional intelligence are relatively new? Because I think many of us didn't grow up with this at the forefront of what was modeled at school and at home, and especially based on the story that you just told us. I feel like that is an experience that would resonate with a lot of people from all kinds of backgrounds. You're on the playground or you're in the classroom, you're getting bullied, and you don't, or I think oftentimes when you're so young, you don't really know how to deal with those situations. And I also imagine oftentimes perhaps you reach out to an adult and they may or may not have an answer for you or help you deal with it. So I feel like a lot of younger kids, especially at that age, you kind of retreat into your room, which is
Hmm.
hopefully a safe space for most children. And then you're trying to figure it out yourself as a kid. So do you
which is
think,
impossible to do, by the way.
right,
Um,
exactly. So is this a conversation that is new in terms of talking about emotions and emotional intelligence?
it's relatively new. The concept of emotional intelligence, was coined. The theory was written back in 1990 by my two mentors, Peter Salovey at Yale and Jack Mayer at the University of New Hampshire. And then it got popularized through a book by an author named Dan Goleman. And since then, we've been cleaning up the concept and testing its validity, et cetera. But it's only 30, 35 years old. So it's a rather new construct. And I think people now heard of the term, but when I do my research and ask people, how much did you learn about emotions and emotion regulation growing up? Most people, about 90% of people said, I learned nothing, really nothing. And only about 7% of people say they learned something in school about it. So, in terms of going from theory to practice to high quality kind of implementation, it's low. For example, Ruler, which is our center's approach to teaching emotional intelligence, I'm proud to say that we're reached 5,000 schools as of this year, which is amazing. But there are about 100,000 schools in the United States. So, that's only 5% of schools. And of course, there's variability in implementation. Um, so I think we're at an inflection point, and my hope is that with the rigorous research that, we at the Center for Emotional Intelligence are doing and others are doing, we're going to get government leaders, company leaders, school leaders to take seriously the value proposition of teaching emotional intelligence.
Well, you mentioned asking people about their experiences, and most people have not had that education as a part of their lives. And part of your work also involves traveling all over and talking to audiences about emotional regulation, as you just mentioned. Is there anything you hear from audience members over and over? Anything that stands out to you?
I mean, I think the big one is like, where have you been all my life?
Right.
Just to be frank, I mean,
Sure.
'cause I think people have a misunderstanding going back to the definition. I think people often think of emotion regulation as being kind of your temperament, meaning, just to be kind of transparent, I am someone who experiences emotions in intense ways. So I, when I get upset, I get really upset. When I'm happy, I get really happy. But going back to the upset feelings, when I was a kid being bullied, or having other struggles, and I would feel anxious or depressed or overwhelmed, I was just trapped with the feeling. I didn't realize there was a thing that was called emotion regulation, that there were research-based strategies that I could use to help me manage my feelings, that, I could do a mindfulness exercise or breathing exercise, or that I could use a cognitive strategy of what's called reappraisal to, you know, get myself out of the funk and think more optimistically about things, or that I could have social support systems and an emotional ally, et cetera, et cetera. And so my vision is to make that a permanent part of our nation's education system. I would argue, going back to my definition of success, that reading and writing and arithmetic, the three R's as they called it, we need to add regulation to that, because if we want a world where people can get along and get ahead, we have to know how to deal with our feelings.
Well, I'll be honest too. If you use the word reprisal for me when I was 7, I probably wouldn't understand what you're saying. But
You
um,
wouldn't, but believe it or not, I'm just going to say that if you visited schools that used our work, by the time you're 7, you're in like second grade.
right.
I mean, these kids are unbelievable at identifying their emotions, using our tool, the mood meter, and also having strategies to deal with their feelings.
Well, I'm really glad that you mentioned that, because just anecdotally, meeting with young kids and having conversation with them, I'm someone who believes that I'm just going to speak to you as an adult. I don't really have a young kid or baby voice per se, as some people do. And it constantly surprises me how aware they are, and how they understand their emotions. At least for when I was a kid, I don't know if I would react the same, or if I had the vocabulary to explain how I feel at those moments. And with that in mind, and with everything you just shared in terms of, it's the conversation is a bit more out in the open, the definitions are a bit more understood. So, for people who think that they are living much of their life in that fight or flight mode, just to go back to that real quick, do you have any tips on how to break out of that cycle? Is it helpful to learn that, to be aware that, oh, I am in a fight or flight mode right now? How can I get out of it?
Yes, I mean, that's why I wrote a whole book on these strategies. Just to give you the background on that. So, my first book is called Permission to Feel, where I make the argument for why we need to take emotions seriously, that we have to give ourselves the permission to have all of our feelings. There's no bad emotions. That was my big argument there. And I did an overview of the skills. And then the pandemic hit. And here I was, like everybody else, mostly in the United States, our center at the university shut down. We're working from home. We're isolated from our family and friends. Um, there's people dying of COVID. There's, vaccines, no vaccines, masks, no masks. I mean, people were really in a very dark and difficult place. And I thought, Mark, you're like the director of the Center for Emotional Intelligence. You got this. And all of a sudden, I was struggling. And then my mother-in-law moved in with us because of a reason that, she was coming to a wedding that happened just before COVID and thought she would go home. And then it was, a moment in time. And truthfully, one night she looked at me and she's like, "Are you really the director of the Center for Emotional Intelligence?" And I'm like, "Not tonight." Um, and so I went up to bed that night thinking, here's this guy, Mark, who has a doctorate in psychology, who's been writing about emotions for 25 years, who is struggling with his own emotions. What the heck is it like for everybody else? And so I started doing research and surveys around what people were feeling and what they needed. And that's how I wrote the book. And so there are steps to this work. And the first one goes back to permission to feel, which is the mindsets. Yes, you might be in fight flight mode. Yes, you might be feeling anxious. You might not be anxious. You might think you're anxious, which is a whole other story. You might also be feeling stress or overwhelm or frustration. So, but the first step is getting people to believe that they have the power to manage their feelings. It is something you can learn. You're not born that way. And there are practical tools to help you do it. The second step is having the vocabulary. So can I test you on your emotional vocabulary?
Sure, go for it.
Okay. I'm not going to embarrass you, I promise.
Okay, now I'm a little bit nervous.
It's good. Well, it's okay. So if I were to ask you, what is the psychological difference between anxiety, stress, and pressure? What would you say?
I feel like, no pun intended, that anxiety is an emotion that is more direct, or it comes to you faster than pressure. Pressure, I feel like it's something that accumulates over time, which causes the anxiety, I suppose. What was the third one?
Stress.
Stress. I feel like stress and pressure to me have similar feelings of the accumulation, that it happens over time versus, so now I think I'm kind of circling back here where the
Sure.
anxiety is a reaction to the two.
Okay. But how confident are you, like, in clearly understanding the differences?
I think if you want me to write a definition, I don't know if I'm super confident in putting words or like a clear definition for all three. But to me, I feel like all three of them are really intricately connected with each other. So I guess if I had to really clearly define them, anxiety is something that happens more immediate. Pressure is something that happens over time, as well as stress. I don't think I'm doing a really good job in defining the three, but you can see from how I'm trying to figure it out in the moment that I don't have a clear ID
And you're
on
not
all three of them.
and you're not alone. This is why, we have to learn and build our emotion vocabulary, because it matters. So anxiety is about uncertainty.
Mm.
I feel anxious when I cannot make a prediction about what's going to happen. So think about like the COVID hits, you're all trapped at home. It's like, when are we going back to work? And, when are things going to get better? Like there's no control over it. And so you're feeling anxious because you're dying to have the control. You can't make the prediction and you're stuck with this spiral. That's anxiety. Stress happened, I'm feeling anxious about what's happening during the pandemic. And then stress is, I got 5,000 emails from schools and people like, we're freaking out. We need help. And I'm just kind of like, okay, I have too many demands and I don't have enough resources to meet those demands. That's what stress is. And then pressure is when something at stake is dependent upon your behavior. Now, you might be listening and thinking, okay, like this is all the ivory tower trying to impress us, with our words here. But how many of us as parents, as partners, as managers have people who, I'm stressed out, I can't take it anymore. And we just take it for, what we hear. But maybe it's not stress. So for example, I'm going to give you even a more provocative one. As a Yale professor, I teach students. And so for years, my students would say things like, I'm stressed, I'm stressed, I'm stressed. And I said, maybe you're stressed, but maybe not. So let me ask you to journal about all of your experiences around stress. What do you think was the top emotion?
Frustration?
It was envy
Oh, okay. Yep.
because they were saying they were stressed, but what they were stressed about was all the comparisons they were making about everybody else. Your father's more connected than my father. Your mother has a better position than my mother in this particular kind of company. You're going to have a better option. You study for less hours and get better grades. Now, on the surface, it looks like stress. But when you really get down into the underlying cause of the feeling, what you notice is that it is envy. Now, from a psychologist standpoint, to help people deal with those very different emotions, it would be very different because you can take all the breathing exercises in the world and package them into your envy reduction, and you're still going to take the breath and then you're going to sit around looking at everybody else saying, you're better than I am, you're more successful than I am.
Right.
So for envy, oftentimes what I help students understand or learn is gratitude. Like, let's take a moment and just reflect on all the things we actually have going for us, not just focus on what we don't have, which, by the way, I think everyone could do more of. Like, everybody can have more gratitude.
Well, there are so many elements and layers here that I would love to explore because I mean I think you just blew our minds on the envy aspect being the top feeling, which makes so much sense once you break it down, right? What were your
Hmm.
students' reactions when you sort of helped them understand what they were feeling better? And I also want to build on that because I would love for you to define feelings because based on our
Yes.
conversation so far, I feel like at least my own upbringing, both at home and in school or in the workplace, I think it's a generation where I think I started in a space where it's a lot more black and white. There are only two emotions. You're either angry
Mm.
or sad, right? And then people react very differently to when you're sad or when you're angry. And depending on, who you are, what you look like, and where you come from. I feel like that definition in of itself has become more complicated as I grown up. And I say complicated not because feelings are complicated, but it's because
Hmm.
we have more understanding and more language and vocabulary to define feelings. So this is just my
Sure.
long-winded way of asking, can you help us define feelings because they're so
Sure.
different from affect or moods, right? And how should we be thinking about those distinctions?
As scientists, we worry about these definitions a lot because we have to measure things in our research and et cetera, et cetera. But I think for the majority of us, it's really going to the feeling words that matter. Nevertheless, I'll give you the definitions. So, an emotion is mostly an automatic response to a stimulus that causes shifts in the way we think, in the way we feel, and in the way we behave. Um, so, for example, if you are crossing a street and a car comes by you really fast, and you're shocked or you're feeling fear. That's an automatic response to a stimulus. That's learned also, by the way, and is rooted in our development. So people have different relationships with different emotions based on how they were raised. A feeling is more of a private subjective experience. So, for example, I've got a great feeling about this interview. I'm enjoying the conversation with you. That's a feeling. A mood is an emotion or a feeling that's less intense and longer in duration. So, for example, if I got into a fight at home, I'm arguing with my partner, and I am in the car and I'm like, I can't take it anymore. And then I get to my office and it's kind of lingering. That would be like I'm irritable or I'm in a bad mood. I'm not in that anger mode, I'm in the irritability kind of mood state. And I think those are the words, of course, then there are dispositions, someone who tends to be on the more cheerful side of things versus someone who may be, a little bit more disagreeable, in their nature. And then, of course, there's mental illness, when you have clinical diagnosis of depression or an anxiety disorder. So there's a large spectrum of concepts within the family. But for everyday, people, I think we use emotions and feelings pretty much interchangeably. And I would say it's just fine.
And before we go to break, I just want to go back to the students' reaction real quick. When you were helping them understand what their stress really means, how did they react to that?
I think they were shocked because, these are very high achieving students who think they have, their knowledge is so spectacular. And when I said to them, guess what? Trick, you're feeling envy, not stress. And, the exercises and the strategies that you are applying for your stress reduction might not be as helpful as the ones that you might use once you now know really how you're feeling. I think they were grateful because it was all of a sudden, oh, wow. So we have a phrase, you got to name it to tame it. You got to label it to regulate it. And so that precision in self-awareness is a gift to people.
You're listening to Dr. Marc Brackett, who's the author of Dealing with Feeling, Use Your Emotions to Create the Life You Want, and founding director of the Yale Center for Emotional Intelligence. After the break, we ask Marc, where do we begin? How can we start building the skills to regulate our nervous systems and center ourselves before we act? Stick with us. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. We all have feelings. Frustration, excitement, worry, joy. But most of us were never taught what to do with them. Today, we're talking about why emotions matter more than we think and how learning to manage them can change the way we live. And a warning to our listeners, this segment contains a brief mention of child sexual abuse. Still with me is Marc Brackett, author and founding director of the Yale Center for Emotional Intelligence. So Marc, earlier we were talking a little bit about family dynamics, and I'm curious to hear where your personal interest in this research began, because you talked about being bullied as a child. Was emotional regulation modeled especially well in your home when you were growing up, or how did this become a focus for you?
I think it's because it wasn't modeled so well. To be frank.
Sure.
And what's interesting, is that I had two parents, both who loved me dearly. I mean, they really loved me. I know that they did. But they had no emotion education. And so my mom suffered from terrible anxiety and, was, used to like lock herself in the room and cry a lot or be overwhelmed or kind of just as they call it, be a little bit hysterical, where she would say things like, I can't handle it. I'm going to have a nervous breakdown. That was her kind of go-to strategy, unfortunately. And my dad was, the stereotypical tough guy from, he grew up in a rough and tumble neighborhood, was actually a gang member when he was younger. And, really just his go-to strategy was, son, you got to toughen up. And I do have a 5th-degree black belt now, I should just say. I still don't think of myself as a tough guy. I think that's, we call that toxic masculinity these days. What does that even mean? And why is that the goal? Again, that's a very interesting phenomenon to think about as it relates to emotion, which is toughen up, kid. That means don't feel your feelings, suppress your feelings, and just to, march forward. And sometimes you do need to do that, but in small doses. If you do that for your whole life, you're probably going to have some physical illnesses and some difficult relationships because emotions have to go somewhere. And so I didn't have great modeling of this. Unfortunately, I also suffered from sexual abuse as a child. Um, my parents' close friend was a pedophile, and I suffered a lot as a kid. I have two brothers, and they had their own challenges, and my parents were dealing with their challenges, and I got left alone a lot. And unfortunately, the person who took care of me was a sex offender. Now, I'm now 56. I feel like I am in the best mental and physical health I've ever been in, and I attribute a lot of that to one individual who happened to be my Uncle Marvin, who happened to be a middle school teacher in the Catskill Mountains of New York State, who happened to be writing a curriculum to teach kids about feelings. And Uncle Marvin moved in with us, not permanently, but just one summer because he was going to graduate school near my hometown. And he was working on this curriculum. And so he'd sit in my backyard and he'd ask me questions like, tell me a time when you felt elated. Tell me a time when you felt alienated. Let's talk through this. And he became the adult that I confided in. And he was the adult who really changed my life around. And so I dedicate a lot of my career and my work to him. And he was the reason behind my first book, Permission to Feel, because I assert that he gave me the permission to feel.
Well,
And yeah, go ahead, please.
no, I was just going to say thank you for sharing that. I'm so sorry to hear that that happened to you, but also very glad that you did end up having an adult figure that helped you figure it out. And it relates to what we were talking about earlier, right? Where when something happens to a young person, you retreat because that's the only way you know how to deal with it. And the word
Yeah,
dealing with it, clearly it was not dealt with, but it's the only thing you
right.
knew how to do it. And so shout out to Uncle Marvin. Thanks, Uncle
Yeah,
Marvin.
he's the hero.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned permission to feel because I did want to ask about that too. Because we'll talk about how children are learning to regulate emotions in schools with our next segment. But for now, especially with what you shared, I want to talk about adults. Your first book,
Hmm.
as you mentioned, published in 2019, was called Permission to Feel. Why do you think so many adults feel like they need permission to emote, especially since, as we've talked about earlier and just now, that many of us did not grow up in a space where you're allowed to emote, and oftentimes the emotions were really just you're angry or you're sad, and that is it.
It's interesting because I think that there's this weird phenomenon that when you emote, even the way you say it, right, emote, it sounds negative, right? It sounds like it's complaining. It sounds like it's drama. And that's not what emotional expression is about. It's about getting our needs met. It's about sharing our truth in the moment. And I think because we're in a society that in many ways teaches us to suppress or, quote unquote, suck it up or toughen up or, all these different phrases that have come about, it's a message. Basically, suppress your feelings because I don't think I have the skills as the adult who is raising you or teaching you to deal with them. That's the truth. And I find this actually in my research and in my public speaking, a lot of adults say the reason why they're uncomfortable asking even their own children how they feel is because A, they think it takes too much time, which is bizarre, but that's another story. Two is fear, because then I don't know what am I supposed to do when my kid tells me they're anxious or overwhelmed. I never dealt with my own anxiety, nevertheless theirs. And three is skill, which relates to the fear. I just don't know what to do. And all this goes back to the whole point, which is why we need an emotion education, why people need to learn these skills. And I want to say something else that's very important, which is that in my research with tens of thousands of people across the world, cross culturally, by the way, including Hong Kong, including Europe, including Australia, Costa Rica, all over the world, when I ask people, did you have an Uncle Marvin or an Aunt Maria, who could have been anybody? It could be a parent, it could be a teacher, it could be a coach. Just did you have someone when you were a child that you felt safe and comfortable with to talk about your feelings? Only 1/3 of people say yes, no matter where I go. 2/3 say no. When I look at the data on who these people are, of the 1/3 that say yes, half of them say it was their mom. Only 5% say it was their father, which is unfortunate that 95% of people don't see their father as someone they can talk to about emotions. So that's important to know. But the other thing that's really interesting is when I ask people to describe those people, the person who gave them permission to feel, there are 3 main characteristics. Do you want to guess what they are? This is my new little game with you again.
Can you re-ask the question?
Yes. Think about the person who gave you permission to feel,
Mm-hmm.
if you had that, or if you didn't, like now as an adult observing the world, the people who you believe are those kinds of people, what would you say are their top attributes?
I think for me, the top attribute with no specific, I think the first would be, does it make sense to say emotional intelligence? Because actually, growing up as a kid, that was a phrase that I was familiar with because it was told to me in terms of IQ versus EQ.
Cool.
And yeah, I know, I know. So I actually was.
Where'd you grow up?
It's crazy. I was actually really aware of the IQ versus EQ conversation, and it was told to me by an adult that having a high EQ, I guess you want to say it like that, is important. And whether or not I truly understood that, I can't really tell you as a 6-year-old or as a 12-year-old if I really did. But I
Mm-hmm.
would say this person has very high EQ because they were
Okay.
able to convey that to me. And the
Nice.
second one would be open mindedness. And
Hmm.
I know for a fact it's because this person also grew up in a situation where their parents are not that open minded. And it's a generational gap that we're talking about here. So I would say high emotional intelligence, open mindedness, and active listening, which I suppose is
Nice.
kind of related to open mindedness. But this person I always felt like heard me. And so I would say those are probably the 3 attributes that I think about first with this person.
Nice. And you're completely aligned with what the research shows. People don't say emotionally intelligent because they just don't think that way in general. But what they say are 3 core attributes. The first is non-judgmental. People say that the person just let me be who I am. They're not trying to change me. They're not telling me anything is wrong with me. They're not judging me. The second is good listener, which you said. And the third is empathy and compassion. And I think it's important for people to hear that non-judgmental, good listening, and empathy, because it doesn't say brilliant, wise, problem solver, fixer, advice giver. And so I think a lot of the fear comes from the adult thinking, I have to solve the emotional challenges. And I'm here to tell you that that's not what people want. They don't want you to solve them or fix them. They just want you to be present. They want you not to be rattled by their experiences and to let them know that you're there to problem solve with them, but not for them.
So I want to go back because we're talking about parenting, whether or not you're a mom or dad or aunt or uncle. Would it be helpful for the child to hear from an adult that, I don't know, like the just admitting that they don't know how to solve the problem or do the thing, but can we do it together? Can we talk it out? Is that a conversation that you feel would be helpful for children to hear? Be-
Extraordinarily helpful.
Especially as you say, I think most of the times, we as kids or whatnots, where we may not actually be looking for an answer per se. We're just looking for someone to listen to us.
Exactly. And just by the way, the mere presence of someone that we think is caring is a strategy right there. I don't know about you, but do you ever have that person in your surroundings and everything is just a little bit better because they're there?
Sure, of course. Thankfully,
Those are the
fortunately.
people. Yes. And those are the non-judgmental, good listeners who, show empathy and compassion. So you don't have to be the knower. You just have to be the person who is willing to engage with someone and be curious and work with them and ask them questions like, what do you need right now? What can I do to be supportive? Um, that's what helps.
Because you, I believe, once said that kids don't need perfect parents; they need regulated ones, which I think is what we're talking about right now.
They need
Um,
good role models.
right? And why? And this is such an obvious question, but it's a big question. I think why is that so important?
Well, let's think about it. Let's do a little role play here. I come home from work as daddy, and I am in a bad mood because I got into a fight with one of my colleagues, and I come home and you're my kid, and you're like, Daddy, Daddy, can we play? And I'm like, you know, honey, leave me alone. I've had a really rough day.
Mm.
And that's it. So, what do I demonstrate there? A, daddy can't regulate. B, daddy can't, build a relationship with this kid because he's dysregulated. And C, kind of dismissing your needs. Now let's imagine the emotionally intelligent father coming home. Mommy, mommy, or daddy, daddy, I want to, can we play? Honey, I have to just let you know, daddy had a really rough day at work. I actually got into a fight with one of my colleagues and I said something that was really unkind. And I feel I'm regretting that. And so if it's okay with you, I want to play with you, but I need about 10 minutes to myself to just think through what I can do tomorrow to make sure that I can, apologize and move forward with my friend. And so this has nothing to do with you. I just need to get this off my chest because I feel really bad about it. All right. So what did I do in that situation? A, I did not dismiss you. I was clear. B, I experienced or I showed my child that daddy has strong feelings, daddy makes mistakes, daddy reflects, daddy problem solves, and daddy uses certain strategies to help him deal with his feelings. All that in like what, 30 seconds?
So I
And
imagine.
so go ahead.
Oh no, I was just gonna say, I imagine once you build that into your habit, it could be easier for those moments because I know a lot of parents listening in and thinking that this is great in theory but so hard to practice. But if you do turn it into a habit, it sounds like it will come more naturally to you that you would explain to your
Exactly.
kid versus lashing out.
And by the way, it's not like a lot of people have this weird misconception about the emotional intelligence work that it's like, dwelling on the feelings and talking about them endlessly. We know that's not helpful to do. We don't want to, that causes rumination. It causes, not, it doesn't lead to good outcomes in general. Eventually, when someone is sharing, you're trying to pivot and help them shift their perspective to help them deal with their feelings, hence the work. And I think showing your kid that, you have feelings, that you make mistakes, that you are looking for ways to apologize and, ask for forgiveness. I mean, what could be better than that as a role model?
You're listening to Marc Brackett, who's the author of Dealing with Feeling: Harness Your Emotions to Create the Life You Want. After the break, we'll talk about how schools across Connecticut are teaching children to identify and regulate their feelings. We'll be back soon. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. Marc Brackett thinks that managing our emotions might be the most important skill we ever learned, and he's here today to talk about why. So, Marc, I'm feeling a little pressure because we only got about 5 more minutes because we're having such a good time here, but I have to ask you what your ruler method is and how schools in Connecticut are incorporating it.
Sure. Well, I'm proud to say that we started off in one district in Connecticut now, and I would say we're probably in a good 40% of Connecticut schools. And RULER is an acronym for the five skills of emotional intelligence. It stands for recognizing, understanding, labeling, expressing, and regulating emotion. And it is an approach to teaching emotional intelligence that has now been adopted by about 5,000 schools across the United States, but hundreds in Connecticut. And it starts with superintendents and district level leaders understanding the value and importance of emotional intelligence in their roles. It also works with principals of schools to help them see their role of being an emotionally intelligent leader so that they're a role model for the teachers and staff and kids in their schools. Then we have curriculum for teachers themselves so that they can see why being an emotionally intelligent educator matters. And then we have work curriculum for kids and also parents. So we call it a whole school or a whole district approach because what we want to do is build a common language from preschooler to superintendent, school board member, custodian, bus driver. Everybody gets an emotion education because we know from our research that the more people who have the skills in a system, the better off everybody is. And there are tools. So there's a mood meter tool that is well known that helps people become more emotionally self-aware. There is a tool called the Meta Moment, which is a tool for self-regulation and emotion management, which helps people contemplate what the best version of themselves looks like, sounds like, and behaves like. And then there's classroom curriculum. And essentially that is all based on the work I did with my uncle. Taking a lesson in history and unpacking the emotions of the characters in history and thinking about how you relate to them as a student growing up in today's world, and thinking about, do they deal with their feelings effectively? If not, what might they have done differently to have better regulated? So it's integrated into the curriculum as well.
Well, we've got about 2 minutes here, but I would love to touch on the long-term impacts of children being shown how to regulate emotions. What do we know about some of those impacts?
What we know is that basically, even as young as kindergarten, that children who are more skilled at regulating their emotions are healthier, happier, and more effective in life. As a matter of fact, we know that emotional regulation is correlated with better mental health, better physical health, better relationship quality, and importantly, longevity. So if you want to live longer, which is what I think a lot of people want to do, you'll be better off if you learn how to deal with your feelings.
And just really quickly, if there's one thing you can leave with our listeners today who may be listening to this or learning about this for the first time, what would you like them to know?
First is give yourself and everyone that you love and everyone that you work with permission to feel. Second, learn the skills of emotional intelligence because they're 100% learnable. And third, it's never too early, it's never too late to help yourself and help other people. And I think this is probably the most valuable skill that you can give yourself and anyone in your community.
You've been listening to Marc Brackett. He's the founding director of the Yale Center for Emotional Intelligence. He's developed a framework called RULER, Recognize, Understand, Label, Express, and Regulate, which is used in over 5,000 schools nationwide. He's also the author of a new book, Dealing with Feeling, Use Your Emotions to Create the Life You Want. Marc, I so appreciate you joining the show today. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so much.
I'm Catherine Shen. Today's show is produced by Chloe Wynn. Our technical producer is Eugene Amatruda. Download Where We Live anytime on your favorite podcast app. And thank you all so much for listening.